Who Killed WCW Episode 4 from Vice. This is the final episode, which covers the final Nitro and what built up to it and the aftermath. This is the one I've been looking forward to the most because based on what we've seen in the build-up and in the previews, this episode was supposed to have a lot of behind-the-scenes footage that had not been seen before, which there was plenty of that in this episode, which was enjoyable. There were, lots of like hand cam footage and like production meeting stuff and things that happened by the ring before the show started for the final Nitro that we had never seen before. And the episode was focused on that, but it really discussed the final 4 to 5 months of WCW. It went over Eric Bischoff's attempt to buy WCW with Fusion Media and how he was trying to gather money for it. It went over Jamie Kellner being promoted to the position of Turner Sports, where he was able to, and television, where he was able to officially cancel wrestling. And they talked about how Jamie Kellner did not like professional wrestling, did not believe in it, and sacrificed it for other shows that would get better ad revenue. Even though wrestling was a very, very, even Nitro at its absolute darkest, like with the absolute least amount of viewership, was still drawing millions of people a week. No matter how bad it got, there were still loyal wrestling fans that had been watching wrestling on the Turner stations for some of them for decades. And they stuck around no matter how bad it got. But it was more about selling. Bischoff called it like waterfront real estate, which is the primetime hours that Nitro and the WCW shows were on. And that Kellner wanted it for other things to sell it. And that is true that pro wrestling has always been seen by advertisers as being kind of lowbrow, and they're kind of embarrassed to be associated with it in some ways. That's why you see oftentimes on Raw, you'll see a bunch of pizza commercials, and you'll see things, not to disparage pizza, but like you won't see anything that's or you'll rarely see any kind of commercial that's in any way for the middle or upper class. It's usually just pizza, fast food, and things like that. Things that aren't really expensive advertising. But they go over all of that, and they talk about Bischoff's plans to do the Big Bang Show, and kind of, these are all things that, if you study the history of WCW, you knew this was what was going on, and they take us through that in a way that I would say was easy to understand. The idea was that Fusion Media would buy WCW, and in January of 2001, and I remember when this was going on because I was just getting on the internet at the time. I was just reading up on the sites and whatnot, the news sites. I remember it was almost a done deal. Like, it felt like it was a done deal. There was letter of intent. All they were waiting for was the transaction to go through. And originally they were going to keep WCW on the Turner networks, and they were going to just have Bischoff and Fusion Media run the company. It just wouldn't be owned by Turner or AOL Time Warner in this case. And Eric and Conan commented on here that it seemed like this time Bischoff was really focused. Like, he had a new energy about him, and he really wanted to make changes. A lot of the rumors were confirmed by Bischoff on here, which he talked about actually on the podcast he does with Conrad, 83 Weeks, about how they were going to move the show to Vegas, and they were going to kind of make it like a highlight piece in Vegas, kind of like what TNA has done in the last few years. If you notice, TNA runs a ton of shows out there in Vegas. That's almost like their current home, at their home base. And because Vegas is a tourist town, so you're always going to have new people to watch your product. And they were going to kind of shoot the TV from just a solo arena in Vegas, like old school territorial. And then as the company would start to grow again, then they would go on the road. That was the plan. It never got that far because WWF swooped in and bought it. And that has always been a very strange situation, because it really, when you have a confirmation that a deal is going to go through, and then another company or another entity comes along and takes the deal from you, 9 times out of 10, it's something shady. It could be something you messed up with the paperwork. It could be something a lawyer messed up, but not very rarely. Usually it's that something happened shady, and they took it off your plate. Jamie Kellner was promoted in March. right before the final Nitro, and that's when everything changed. But the conspiracy theory that the fans have had throughout the years is that the reason as to why WCW was sold to Vince and not to Eric was because Turner knew that if it was sold to Vince, Vince would just destroy it. That people got into his ear, into like, and basically they knew that Vince's ego would never let him really rebuild the WCW brand, which is kind of what happened. There is truth to that. It wasn't just Vince, but I mean, you know, they knew that Vince would eventually just kill the brand because he would never put that brand over his own. And all of that is true, right? And WCW, or at least Jamie Kellner, this has been the conspiracy theory. People think that Turner, Time Warner, whatever, AOL, they felt that if Eric got WCW and rebuilt it, it would be looked frowningly upon AOL Time Warner for selling it. It's like you had this incredible, huge television show and you sold it, and this guy just rebuilt it when it could have been yours. Like, that has always been the conspiracy theory. But I think the more realistic theory, I guess, is that Jamie Kellner just really, really didn't like wrestling, and Turner did not have the power to stop him. Brad Siegel on this documentary says that he was the one who either made the pitch or agreed to sell WCW. So he should be blamed, if anybody. Not just him, but a few different people. But he's one of the people who pushed for the sale. So they discuss how Jamie Kellner, when they told them, we're not just going to sell WCW, we're also going to not renew the time slot. So we're canceling the company from our networks. And they talk about how wrestling at the time, and even now, without television, a company as big as WCW, without television, even now, I would say, nowadays we have internet streaming, and there's other ways to make money. There's other revenue streams that have opened up now because of streaming and things like that. But back in 2001, a wrestling company the size of WCW without television was gone, because you needed the TV to sell the pay-per-views and the house shows. You needed the TV to sell tickets to the live shows and to the TV tapings. Like, you needed television. Wrestling cannot live without television of a company that had all these big contracts. An indie company could, of course. Local little indies can, but not WCW. The value of the company didn't matter anymore because there was no TV to push anything. So what are you buying? A bunch of expensive contracts and some rings and some cameras? Like, what are you going to do with it? And that's kind of the whole point. Like, well, why should we spend money on this if we can't even have a TV place to put it on? Now, I remember there were a lot of rumors in 2001, and this is why I'm glad that if you didn't live through this, I'm glad you're watching this video, because I'll give you some extra information. There was a lot of rumors that Bischoff was trying to get a deal with Fox, because also Heyman had tried to get ECW on Fox, and there were other networks that for a time were open to having wrestling, because this is right during the Attitude Era, the wrestling boom. But what happened was WWF had pulled so far ahead of everybody else that the networks didn't want wrestling. They wanted WWF. You understand what I'm saying? They wanted the WWE, or soon to be called WWE brand. They wanted, in other words, people didn't want arena football. They wanted NFL. And as a result of that, other companies never got these TV deals. You know, because there was a ton of rumors, guys, in '01 about about like other networks showing wrestling. But it turned out at the end of the day, they didn't want wrestling. They wanted the number one company, not the number two or number three. When they get to the part with the final Nitro, they interview a lot of the guys that were there, like Goldberg, DDP, Booker T. And it's funny, Nash was there, like he was in the company, but he wasn't around. And they even talk about how Nash didn't even show up for that final Nitro. And he almost, again, he comes off really bad here, because everybody knows that Nash is a guy who kept the Turner contract and got paid for, like, you know, a year of sitting at home, which I can't blame him for that, because wrestling is hard and your body should need time to heal. So I'm not blaming him for that part, right? But you have other guys like Booker who are such go-getters who are like, you know what? We're auditioning. Because they talk about that. He's like, because Steiner and Booker opened the last Nitro, and he saw it as an audition. He saw it as Bruce Pritchard, Shane McMahon, Gerald Briscoe, who were actually in Panama City on that Nitro. They're watching me. and I have to put on a good show because I want them to sign me, because Booker was all about trying to make it in WWF. He knew the schedule was harder, but he was a go-getter, and I have a lot of respect for that man because he did that. But yeah, they interview a lot of the guys to give their thoughts, which was a smart choice. On a personal note, I watched the first Nitro and I watched the last Nitro. I was a lot younger, live. I cannot begin to tell you, because on my television dial, I think TNT was 29 and USA was 30. They were literally next to each other on the channel lineup. I cannot begin to tell you how bizarre seeing Shane McMahon on Nitro was. I cannot begin to tell you how weird it was to see Vince on Nitro, to see the infamous final segment of Nitro where they did the simul feed to both TNT and USA. That was, again, I cannot describe in words what a bizarre night that was, and I will never forget it as long as I live. Wrestling fans that didn't understand the history of wrestling on Turner, of Crockett, of WCW, NWA, and WWF can never really understand how utterly strange that is. And even now, so many years later, it still gives me goosebumps. And then, of course, the elephant in the room is this company got sold to WWF for, under $3 million. A company that was valued so much higher, WWF got it for pennies. There were main event talent in the company, or even mid-card talent in WWF that could have bought that company for themselves. Because in the grand scheme of things, under $3 million for a company that big is an insane steal. And yes, there was no television, but still, you're getting the entire tape library going all the way back decades, right? You're getting equipment that, even though WWF had their own equipment, still expensive stuff. They could have sold it off, auctioned it off. It was insane the deal they got, and Bischoff suspects there was some shadiness, and a lot of people did. It wasn't just him. And I meant to say $4 million. I remember the rumors were around $3 million, but it was something to that effect, 3 or 4. It was not a lot of money in the grand scheme of things, for a company that big. And the conspiracy theory is mentioned on this documentary. The person specifically who they said facilitated it was Stu Snyder, which was the rumor for a long time because he used to work at Turner and then he worked at WWF. And they're saying that he kind of set up a backdoor deal with Brad Siegel, and that's what wound up leading to the sale where WCW was sold so cheaply. And Siegel was the one that had pushed Jamie Kellner or suggested it. Again, this stuff has been talked about for a long time, but you never hear these things on. And that's why, even though this documentary's got issues, I do appreciate it existing, because you're never going to hear these stories from the WWE fluff pieces. They're never going to go into this type of shit because it might make them look bad. But the reality is, if you know anything about business, inside deals and insider trading and stuff like this happens all the time. Business is very shady, and sometimes these types of things don't ever get found out. Stu Snyder and Brad Siegel both deny it. Bischoff explains also about the contracts that were moved to WWF, and I remember when all of this happened, like I said, they picked up a handful of guys. It was maybe 50 guys, 40, 50 guys. But the big stars like Goldberg, Nash, and Hogan, they had contracts with Time Warner. They didn't have contracts with WCW. They had contracts with the parent companies that they had to honor, even if they sold WCW. So because of that, you had guys like Goldberg not debut in WWF till 2003. Hogan and the rest of the NWO came in 2002, a year after the sale. So these guys got to sit at home for a year and get paid. And like I said, I don't blame them for that. I get it. Why would you risk getting hurt for a pay cut? And WWF did not want to pay these large, insane guaranteed deals to guys who they didn't create themselves. And I remember it made perfect sense. I remember reading that if Vince brought Goldberg in and bought out his contract, it would tip the scale of the WWF dressing room, because they would all be wanting the same kind of money, because those are the guys that had been there during the rough times, and it would have felt like, wow, he's paying this guy so much when he wasn't even here during the hard times, like Shawn Michaels and Undertaker, who had been in WWF even through the Monday Night War. They never left. So it's one of those situations. Of course, you can debunk that as well. There's counter arguments to be made about all of this. The last part of this episode dealt with the aftermath. They crammed a lot in and they missed a lot of stuff, like Scott Hall coming over and Nash's comments on that, and then Bischoff's run from 2002 to 2005. I mean, they didn't go into a lot of detail at all. They zoomed past it. So they just tried to get past this part as fast as possible because it's not really that relevant to the death of WCW, but it is important to show the people what happened to these people after WCW ended. The final segment is when they ask everyone who killed WCW. Brad Siegel says it was the combination of multiple factors and egos, and then Kevin Nash says, well, this guy won't even take accountability for it. The reality is, I don't think the documentary really gave us a solid answer, but the real answer is in there if you weed through what people are saying. It wasn't one thing that killed WCW. It was a multitude of factors. It was a multitude of unfortunate events, everything from the large contracts to the burnout creatively, to the mistakes they made booking, to the mistakes they made on the television, to the devaluing of shows, to the AOL Time Warner merger, Jamie Kellner's, promotion, all that stuff. Every single thing was a factor. All of it. And anybody who tells you otherwise is just biased. Everything was a factor. Some big, some little. It does get emotional at the end because the guys all reminisce on the good times, and even Bischoff himself gets emotional, which, some have said that this documentary sort of rehabbed him. I'm not really sure about that because even guys like Booker said that he was the reason why WCW wound up failing, which he was definitely a reason. But still, it's a lot of people have blamed Bischoff and Russo. In fact, Brett blamed them both. And yes, rightfully so to a degree, but there's other factors that were outside of their control and other factors that were in their control, but that was a blind spot ultimately that they did not see or understand. That's ultimately it. And Medusa gives a warning about history repeating itself, that we should learn from it. But sometimes it kind of does feel like history is repeating itself with some of the mistakes AEW has made. And even though Tony Khan said they would never make these mistakes, they have made them. And it's not going to be the same thing, though. Don't ever compare WCW's demise to if AEW were to close its doors someday. It's not the same thing at all. I might do a whole video on that because it is not the same thing. Very different ownership. It's not the same. So the documentary was okay. I mean, we didn't learn anything new. They did explore things that had been discussed that had never been talked about before in any other documentary, so I appreciated that. But to nail down an answer, I kind of knew from the beginning it would be this. So I think if you're a fan who's educated very well in this, if you think you are, you may not be. You may not be. But you might be. Hopefully, if the topic is interesting, you would like it. But it wasn't like they came to a definitive conclusion because there is none. So, yeah, man, not the best, but certainly not the worst documentary about this. I think the 2004 WWE Monday Night War DVD, the '04 one, that's like the most biased nonsense ever. Like, some of the points were made here that made, but a lot of stuff that made was just obviously leaning in the direction that's pro WWF and villainizing WCW. So at least this was a bit more unbiased. So that's it. Those are my thoughts. Have a great one.